Kathie Lee Gifford. She's a four-time Emmy-winning TV host.
For most of her life, Kathie Lee Gifford has been introduced to America the same way. The woman with the big laugh, the wine glass at 11 in the morning, and a warmth that made total strangers feel like they were sitting in her kitchen. She spent 15 years trading jokes with Regis Philbin and another 11 laughing through the fourth hour of Today with Hoda Kotb. But the story that made her famous was never the whole story. Underneath the banter was a woman who had survived public humiliation, sudden widowhood, a body that eventually betrayed her, and a childhood that never let her put down roots. Now, at 72, Kathie Lee has been unusually candid about just how hard the last several years have actually been, and the fuller picture is far more human than the one that used to greet America every weekday morning. She was born Catherine Lee Epstein on August 16, 1953, in Paris, France, not because her family had any particular love of the city, but because her father, Aaron Epstein, was a U.S. Navy Chief Petty Officer stationed there at the time. Her mother, Joan, was a former Navy secretary who had once sung on the radio, and music filled the Epstein household the way it does in families, where nobody quite gives up on a dream. They just folded into ordinary life. The family moved through Europe for several years before finally settling in Bowie, Maryland, in the late 1950s, where Aaron eventually left the service and worked as a newspaper distributor and insurance agent. It was a modest, unglamorous landing after years of relocation, but it gave young Kathie Lee something she badly needed: a hometown, a high school, and a folk group called Pennsylvania Next Right, where she got her first real taste of standing in front of an audience. Faith arrived early, too, and in an unexpected way. Kathie Lee's father was Jewish, and she grew up steeped in Jewish tradition, even as her mother's side of the family carried an English and French-Canadian Methodist background. At 12 years old, she watched a Billy Graham-produced film called The Restless Ones and became a born-again Christian, a decision that would end up shaping nearly every major turn her life would take from that point forward. It's easy to read that as a small, tidy detail from a childhood biography, but for Kathie Lee it became something closer to a permanent internal compass, one she would reach for again and again decades later, when the ordinary comforts of fame and money had nothing useful left to offer her. Her path into show business did not begin with morning television at all. At 17, she won Maryland's Junior Miss Pageant and traveled to Mobile, Alabama, for the national competition, where she met the singer and pageant co-host Anita Bryant. Bryant, seeing something in the teenager, invited her to live and work at her Florida home as a secretary and babysitter, and encouraged her toward a career as a Christian singer. Kathie Lee took the offer, and what followed was a long, unglamorous stretch most successful entertainers don't like to talk about. Touring Bible Belt revival meetings, singing in Southern Baptist churches, cutting gospel records that never made her famous, and studying drama and music at Oral Roberts University. She married her first husband, Christian music producer Paul Johnson, in 1976, and the two of them worked in that same modest Christian entertainment world together before divorcing in 1983. Her break into mainstream television came almost by accident. She had landed a small recurring role as a singer on the syndicated game show named That Tune in the late 1970s, then picked up occasional substitute anchor work on Good Morning America after a producer heard her hosting an AM radio show. None of it looked like the beginning of a legendary career. It looked like a working entertainer piecing together opportunities, wherever she could find them. Then, in June 1985, she was hired to replace Ann Abernathy as co-host of a local WABC-TV program called The Morning Show, alongside a New York broadcaster named Regis Philbin. 3 years later, the show went into national syndication as Live, with Regis and Kathie Lee, and the rest is the part of her story most people already know. 15 years of unscripted banter, genuine laughter, and a chemistry with Philbin that no amount of careful producing could have manufactured from scratch. It was during this same period of rising fame that she met Frank Gifford, the Pro Football Hall of Famer and longtime Monday Night Football broadcaster. Frank had already lived one extraordinary life by the time they met: a standout career with the New York Giants, an NFL MVP award in 1956, and, after a bruising hit in 1960 nearly ended his career, a second act in the broadcast booth that made him just as recognizable as he'd been on the field. The two married in 1986, and together they had two children, Cody, born in 1990, and Cassidy, born in 1993. For years, viewers of Live got a running commentary on the Giffords' home life, and the family became something like a national fixture, the on-air proof that a demanding television career and a warm family life weren't necessarily a contradiction. Fame in the late 1980s and early 1990s brought Kathie Lee far more than a talk show host's paycheck. She released music, appeared in television specials, hosted the Miss America pageant, and became one of the most recognizable pitchwomen in the country, fronting ad campaigns for Carnival Cruise Lines and later for Slim Fast. In 1996, she was reportedly earning around $9 million a year licensing her name to a clothing line sold through Walmart. That same year, the line became the subject of a very different kind of headline when the labor activist Charles Kernaghan and the National Labor Committee reported that some of the clothing bearing her name was being produced in overseas sweatshops, in factories where workers, in some cases teenagers, were reportedly subject to poor and unfair conditions. Kathie Lee has said she was genuinely blindsided by the allegations, and rather than simply distancing herself from the brand, she went on to work with U.S. lawmakers on efforts aimed at protecting garment workers from exploitative conditions. It was, by any measure, an ugly and very public controversy to have to manage, and it landed at almost the exact same moment her personal life was about to become an even bigger story. Then came 1997, and the year Kathie Lee has since said reshaped how she understood privacy, forgiveness, and her own marriage. A flight attendant named Susan Johnson came forward with allegations of an affair with Frank, and the story detonated across the country after audio from a hidden camera sting was sold to a tabloid. There was no quiet way to process a betrayal like that. It played out on front pages and in living rooms nationwide, while Kathie Lee was still expected to show up to work the next morning, one of the most visible women on American television, and be warm and funny for an audience of millions who already had an opinion about what she should do next. Many assumed the marriage was over. She has said publicly, more than once, that her Christian faith was central to the decision she ultimately made, to stay and to work through it. It wasn't a decision everyone understood, and it wasn't one she has ever pretended was easy. But the marriage held, and it held for another 18 years, until Frank's death in August 2015. Frank died suddenly and of natural causes at the family's Connecticut home, a week before his 85th birthday. The loss made national headlines because Frank Gifford was, by any measure, football royalty. But for Kathie Lee, it was simply the end of a 29-year marriage, the disappearance of the person who had been the steady center of her adult life, through scandal, grief, and everything in between. 3 months later, the family made a decision that added an entirely different layer to their mourning. They agreed to have Frank's brain studied after his death, and the results confirmed what they had quietly suspected. Frank had chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the degenerative brain disease linked to repeated head trauma that has since been found in hundreds of former football players. The family chose to make the diagnosis public, hoping it might contribute to research and awareness around a disease that, at the time, could still only be confirmed after death. Kathie Lee has since said, in a Today Show tribute not long after his passing, that they laughed together right up to the end, and that Frank died at peace with his life and his faith. Years later, she would also acknowledge something more complicated, that in some sense, he had been slipping away long before he actually died, a realization that reshaped her grief even after the initial shock had already settled. In 2019, after 11 years co-hosting the fourth hour of Today alongside Hoda Kotb, Kathie Lee left the show, telling those close to her it was time to focus on writing, producing faith-based films, and music, work that had often taken a backseat during her decades in front of a camera. She left New York, a city that by then held as many memories of Frank as it did of her career, and relocated to Nashville, Tennessee. It wasn't framed publicly as a retirement so much as a redirection, a chance to build an identity around creating things rather than simply appearing on screen every weekday morning. In Nashville, she wrote books, several of them centered on her faith, including a series exploring biblical figures, and continued producing and writing faith-oriented films for networks like Hallmark. It was, by her own account, one of the more meaningful stretches of her adult life. Proof that reinvention in your 60s is not only possible, but can be genuinely fulfilling. What she could not simply write or produce her way through was her own aging body. And this is the chapter of her life she has been strikingly candid about only very recently. In the summer of 2024, at 70 years old, Kathie Lee underwent a total hip replacement after months of what she described as agonizing pain that doctors initially misdiagnosed as a spinal issue. She later said her surgeon told her flatly that he had rarely seen hips in worse condition, the accumulated cost of decades of an active, physically demanding life. She recovered, by her own admission, too fast and too aggressively, determined to get back to her grandchildren rather than to rest the way her doctors told her to. That determination came at a cost. In the months that followed, Gifford suffered a fractured pelvis and separately broke her arm after a fall in her sleep that was made worse by an additional fall on uneven pavement. On top of that came cataract surgery to correct vision problems that had begun affecting her depth perception. In a candid interview published in the summer of 2026, now 72 years old, she described the accumulated toll of that year bluntly. She said the pain, at its worst, was debilitating enough that she admitted to wanting to die a few times, though she has been careful to clarify that this was never a thought of self-harm, simply the exhausted honesty of someone in relentless physical pain. She has joked, with the same wit that made her famous, that she felt like Mr. Potato Head, with pieces falling off one after another. But underneath the joke was something more serious. A woman confronting, for the first time in a career built on constant motion, just how much independence she had always taken for granted. What makes this chapter different from the earlier ones is the sheer honesty of it. Kathie Lee has never been shy about her faith or her family, but she built an entire television career on a specific kind of performed cheerfulness, the expectation that no matter what she was carrying privately, she would show up warm, funny, and unbothered for the cameras. In these recent interviews, that performance has quietly fallen away. She has talked openly about 6-day-a-week physical therapy, about the frustration of a body that no longer moves the way it used to, and about the humbling experience of needing help with basic daily tasks after a lifetime of doing everything herself. She has also talked about what got her through it, her faith, her sense of humor, and her determination to be present for her 5 grandchildren, born to Cody and Cassidy over the past several years, children she has said she wants to physically run around with for as many more years as she is given. Looking at the full arc of her life, the pattern is hard to miss. This is a woman who spent a rootless childhood learning to adapt to new towns and new faces because her father's Navy career gave her no other choice. She spent years singing in half-empty rooms and touring revival meetings for almost no money before her career finally found its footing. She endured a public, humiliating scandal in her marriage and chose, against considerable outside pressure, to stay and rebuild rather than walk away. She lost her husband suddenly, then learned in the months afterward just how much he might have been quietly struggling with in his final years. She started over in her 60s in a new city, building a new identity around creativity rather than visibility. And now, in her 70s, she is doing something she rarely did during her decades on morning television, telling the truth about how hard it has actually been, without dressing it up in the easy cheerfulness that made her famous in the first place. Even in the middle of that recovery, Kathie Lee has not slowed down creatively. She has continued writing, releasing books in a faith-based historical series that reimagines biblical figures, and has spoken about filming a documentary reflecting on her own life and career. She has also spoken more openly than she once did about her personal life outside of work, including navigating dating again in her 70s after decades of marriage and then years of widowhood, a subject she approaches with the same blend of humor and candor she now brings to talking about her health. None of it looks like a woman winding down. If anything, it looks like a woman who has finally stopped performing the version of herself that television once required, and started simply being whoever she actually is on a given day. Hip replacement, physical therapy schedule, grandchildren, faith, and all. That shift matters, because it reframes everything that came before it. For 15 years on live, and another 11 on today, audiences were given a very specific version of Kathie Lee Gifford. Unshakable, endlessly cheerful, always ready with a laugh or a glass of wine before noon. It was never entirely false. Those who know her describe someone whose warmth is genuine, but it was also, necessarily, incomplete, because television built around daily cheerfulness rarely leaves room for the parts of a person's life that are heavy, complicated, or simply exhausting. The gap between what she showed audiences each morning and what she was actually carrying. A marriage tested publicly. A husband's decline she wouldn't fully understand until after his death, and eventually a body that no longer cooperated no matter how much willpower she brought to it, is the real substance of her story. Kathie Lee Gifford is still, by every account, a woman who leads with humor and faith. She still calls herself a tough broad, and she means it. But the real story of her life was never really the polished, laughing face that greeted America every weekday morning for the better part of 3 decades. It was what that face was quietly covering for. The resilience nobody applauded because nobody knew it was happening. The private grief that never made it to air. The decision, made over and over across 5 decades, to keep showing up anyway. That may be the most honest thing Kathie Lee Gifford has ever revealed about herself. Not in a single dramatic confession, but in the accumulated weight of everything she carried while still finding a way to smile.